I am thrilled today's guest. He's a return guest. I'm a big fan. Chris Wallace is a household name. He's got 2 shows. Who's Talking to Chris Wallace, with new episodes streaming Fridays on Max. Used to be HBO, used to be HBO Max. Now it's just Max. And he's, of course, the host of the Chris Wallace Show, with new episodes airing Saturdays at 10 a.m. on CNN. And he's got a brand new book out that's only a day or 2 out. And by the time this comes out, it'll be a bestseller. Countdown 1960, the behind-the-scenes story of the 312 days that changed Americans' politics forever. The parallels, and we're going to get into it, between that and today are really stunning. And what's amazing, to write a book about a political campaign, and it's got the mafia, and it's got celebrities, and it's got intrigue, and it's got cheating, and it's got racism. I mean, it's got everything in there, every juicy thing you can have in there.
Well,
not to call racism juicy, every salacious up
well,
and
let
down
me just
bad
say,
things, right?
we should stop right there, because that's the best introduction you could have given me. First of all, good to be with you again, Donny. And there are 2 reasons I wrote the book. And the first is exactly what you said. It is a great story. 2 fascinating characters, Jack Kennedy and Richard Nixon. As you say, the mafia's involved, an illicit affair, all kinds of backroom money, all kinds of backroom deals. And then so that's one reason, and we can get into that. Also, the first televised debate between 2 presidential candidates in history, and then the parallels to 2020 and to today, because that's an election that may have been stolen, and the loser decided, you know what, for the good of the country, if not for myself, I'm going to accept the peaceful transfer of power and not make a fuss about it. And it sets everything we know that's happened since election night 2020 on its head.
We're gonna sell a bunch of books. First, just a couple of little current event stuff. Love your take on this, beyond the obvious, that the state of the race is a deadlock at this point. Anything you feel in your gut as we're about 28 days out?
No, I mean, in terms of who's going to win, no.
Yeah.
When you got a poll and it's inside the margin of error and it switches, Trump is up by 2 points or Harris is up by 3 points, and in the actual 6 or 7 key swing states, it's even tighter than that. It really, the polls are irrelevant at that point. It becomes much more a function of ground games. And that is one area where I would think that Kamala Harris has an advantage, because she has done it the old-fashioned way. She's worked her campaign, which has a boatload of money, has worked with the Democratic National Committee, and they have got thousands of volunteers on the ground. They're engaging with voters. They've got a whole operation to actually get them to vote either early. Speaking of which, I voted yesterday.
Good for you.
I live in D.C.
Okay.
I got my mail-in ballot. I guess they sent it to everybody because I didn't ask for it.
Right.
I signed it and I mailed it, and I got to say, it always makes me feel good to vote. To feel like, okay, there's this big process, and we talk about it and report it, but I actually get to fill in that little circle.
I love it.
So anyway,
I love it to the point. I love it to the point that I don't do mail-in. I like going there. I like standing in line. I like putting it in. There's something that is very nourishing and real and American and just feels good about voting.
I completely agree with you. The only difference is I'm busy on election day because we're part of the coverage of that night, so I don't usually get to vote on election day. And but that was certainly one of the interesting stories. And what I was going to say is, I know we were talking about the advantage that Harris has. Trump has separated the get out the vote from his campaign, from the Republican Party. He's got some independent groups doing it. And, they may turn out to be gangbusters. They could also just turn out to be a bust. So I would have to give a point of advantage there to Harris.
Yeah. How worried are you if Harris wins? What happens post-election day? And you have everybody on. You have one of the hosts on Fox talking about a civil war. We know he's already setting it up that the election is rigged if he loses. How dangerous of a place do you think we're in as America?
Oh, look, I mean, you can't have gone through 2020 and have gone through January 6th of 2021 and not see, God forbid, I certainly hope it doesn't happen. It didn't happen in 1960, but, you see you can't rule out the possibility of violence and of disorder. And, I just hope that as in 2021, that the guardrails hold in the courts and they hold in terms of law and order. And that, yes, it was ugly and unprecedented in our country, but we got through it. But you can't be sure that's going to happen again.
No, as a matter of fact, one would say the probability is it wouldn't. The guardrails are not going to be there in ways that we know at this point. And particularly also if he wins as president, it's scary in that what the checks, you're not going to have the Gary Cohns there anymore. You're not going to have the Kellys and the Mattises and the Steve Mnuchins. It's a very different group that's going to be surrounding him. And I've talked many times on Morning Joe, as many have, and all of us are talking about the threat to democracy. And what's amazing is I talk to people and they tilt their heads and go, nah, that can't happen. Where it's telling you he is doing the authoritarian playbook. There's no gray area here.
I don't disagree with that. And, I think it's interesting. There are probably a lot of reasons that Trump picked Vance as his running mate. But one of them, I fear, is that Vance made it clear he wouldn't have done on January 6th of 2021 that Mike Pence did.
Yeah.
That where Pence said the Constitution forbids me from challenging the electoral vote and sending it back to the states. Vance has said, I wouldn't do that. And, this speaks to your point that as Trump's term, 4 years in office, ran, you could see him kicking out the people. When he came in, he knew what he didn't know, and he wanted the approval of the establishment. And you saw people like Jim Mattis and Rex Tillerson and Gary Cohn as the national economic advisor. But as time went on, he wanted people who would do his will and wouldn't say, I'm sorry, Mr. President, that's just not a good idea. Yeah. And I think he would come in with that mindset. I mean, look at it this way, Donny. Just as a thought experiment for a moment, if Trump wins, this is a guy who was impeached twice. This is a guy who's been shot at twice. This is a guy who was indicted 4 times, I think 94 criminal charges. And he could still, and let's assume for the sake of argument, and he's elected president. Why wouldn't he feel kind of bulletproof? And I mean that literally and figuratively.
Right.
Why wouldn't he feel invulnerable?
We're going to get to the book in a second. I don't think people really comprehend how dark it can get. I am very, very, very pessimistic about what our world would look like. But let's get to the book, because it's so fascinating. What you referenced that this election, a lot of people think was stolen by Daley's machine in Chicago. Illinois was talk about the kind of potential stealing of the election. What happened afterwards?
Well, first of all, it was unbelievably close. One of the closest elections ever. It was decided by 100,000 votes, which is 0.17%, not even 0.2%, separating Nixon and Kennedy. And there were in 2 states particularly, Illinois, which was run by Richard J. Daley, who was an old-fashioned city boss who ran the Cook County Democratic machine, and Texas, where the big power was Lyndon Johnson, who was a senator, the Senate Majority Leader, and the running mate to Jack Kennedy, that there was pretty egregious vote fraud. In Illinois, it was decided by 8,800 votes, and what happened was that downstate Illinois is almost like the South, very conservative, very Republican-oriented, and the votes from the South came in earlier. And Daley, because you would think in a big city that the vote would be counted faster, held back the votes and in effect saw what was the target, what did he have to meet. And suddenly the votes came in, and the Chicago Tribune said with, quote, fantastic pluralities in one ward, Kennedy beat Nixon 10-1, 20,000 to 2,000. In another precinct, there were 88 votes and there were only 20 people registered. And when people started to investigate, and try to see the ballot boxes, they were either missing, or some of them, when they opened them, like Al Capone's vault with Geraldo Rivera, they were empty. Now, in Texas, it was the paper ballots. There were 2.3 million ballots cast, and half of them, 1.2 million, were with paper ballots. And in Texas, you not only had to check the name of the person you were voting for, but you also had to scratch out the names of all the other candidates who you weren't voting for. And if you didn't, then it went to an election judge who decided, well, was the intent clear? And in Republican areas of Texas, up to 40% of the Nixon votes were disqualified. And in heavily Democratic areas like Stark County down on the Mexican border, none of the Kennedy votes were disqualified. So even though it was 46,000 votes, you can easily see how that could have ended up swaying that election. And if just those two states, Donny, Texas and Illinois, had gone for Nixon instead of Kennedy, Nixon is the president.
Absolutely. One thing I was really surprised to learn, you hear the Kennedy name and you think about civil rights, you think about progressiveness, that between Jack Kennedy and Nixon, Nixon was actually the more progressive on civil rights. You write in the book that, that initially JFK was almost seemed to be uncomfortable around people of color.
Yeah, it was a surprise to me too. And in fact, until well into the campaign, had never even met Martin Luther King. And also, remember, the South was the Dixiecrat South at that point. And one of Kennedy's concerns was that the segregationist Dixiecrat South, you didn't want to get too far to the left on civil rights because you could lose the votes in some of those southern states. So he was very reluctant, at least early on, to come out very strongly for civil rights. Now, look, Nixon was not
a bastion of
a great civil rights activist
right.
either, but he was better than Kennedy.
Yeah.
He had met with King. He supported a strong civil rights platform in the civil rights plank in the Republican platform. And he was generally seen as being more progressive on civil rights than Kennedy was.
Of course, 1960, the birth of the debates, still probably the most famous debate. I mean, we've had certainly some couple of very colorful ones this year. Most people don't realize there were four. Everybody thinks, the first debate is the one that Nixon was kind of sweaty and clammy and really was where the election was kind of, most people think, or a lot of people think, was decided. Talk to me about the birth of the debates and how that happened.
Well, first of all, there'd never been any presidential debates, the two major candidates, on television or not.
Right.
And so, with the advent of television, the television networks really were the driving force. And a guy named Robert Kempner, who was the head of NBC, made a big push for it. And so Congress had to pass a law that allowed the fairness doctrine so that they didn't have to have every third and fourth and fifth party candidate. They could just have the two major candidates. And as soon as they passed that law, Kennedy immediately accepted it. And the reason he accepted it was because there was kind of a stature gap. Nixon had been vice president for 8 years. He'd been all over the world. He was seen as more of a heavyweight than Kennedy. So Kennedy thought, if I can share a stage with him, that automatically elevates me and lowers him a little bit. Nixon prided himself on his ability as a debater. I'm not sure it was the smartest thing for him to do it, but of course, he felt, if I don't, it looks like I'm scared of this guy, and I'm not scared, and I'm supremely confident. But when they actually went into the debate, Nixon had suffered a serious staph infection. He'd banged his knee getting out of a limousine and had been in the hospital, Walter Reed Medical Center, for 2 weeks, lost 10 or 15 pounds, his collar of his shirt was kind of hanging empty on his neck. He also had a famously sort of sallow complexion and a big 5 o'clock shadow.
Yeah.
So Kennedy always seemed in this entire election to be 1 or 2 steps ahead of Nixon. He went out to California. He got a nice tan, even though it was in black and white. He just looked robust on the air. There were gray walls in the studio. So Kennedy wears a dark blue suit and a white shirt, and he's got a almost ruddy complexion. Nixon comes in. He's sallow. They go up to, and he's also wearing a gray suit, which blends in with the background. I mean, just Google it and look at the picture of the two of them, and it's just,
that's it.
Just seeing the physical picture, it's pretty dramatic. And Kennedy, because he has this tan, when they offer him makeup, he says, No, I don't need it. And Nixon hears that and he thinks, well, I can't ask for makeup if Kennedy didn't.
Right.
But Nixon needed it. He needed it because he was sick. He was underweight. He had the 5 o'clock shadow. He ended up putting something Donny called lazy shave on his
Oh,
face, which is
Jesus.
basically like if you were going out to dinner, you'd put this on to cover the 5 o'clock shadow. It didn't. And he basically looked like hell in the debate, and Kennedy looked great. And at one point in the middle of the debate, Richard J. Daley, the mayor of Chicago, turns to the guys watching it on TV and says, "My God, they embalmed Nixon before he died." And Henry Cabot Lodge, who was his running mate, very much a Boston Brahmin, former senator and ambassador to the UN, at the end of the debate goes, "God damn it, that SOB just lost the election." So you can't overstate how big the election was. And to give you a sense, this is an example of where Nixon outsmarted himself. He thought, that the interest in the debates will build. So I want the first debate
one, yeah,
to be on domestic affairs, which was Kennedy's strength, and the last debate, or the third debate, I think, of four, I want it to be on foreign affairs, which was where he had an advantage. Well, that was exactly the opposite. The first debate was the big debate. That was the one that, you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. So it played to Kennedy's strength, Nixon's weakness on substance and on style and looks. And I think it probably won the election for Kennedy.
So Joe Kennedy, a thuggish figure to say the least, and there was a lot to keep quiet about him and his life, and he was obviously the puppeteer, very behind what was going on.
Yeah, he was worth about $400 million, which is a lot of money.
He was one of the richest guys in the country. People don't realize, they know the Kennedys were wealthy, but he was, I think, one of the top 10 wealthiest people in the country.
Which is about the equivalent of $4 billion today. And he put together the best operation. I mean, he basically decided, I want my son to be president. And in fact, it was his oldest son, Joe Jr., who he wanted to be president. And then Joe Jr. was killed during World War II in an airplane crash, explosion. And as soon as that happened, Joe said, no, okay, Joe's out of the picture. Jack is going to be the president. And so he first of all had the best campaign money can buy. They got Lou Harris, the famous Lou Harris poll. He was at that point a private pollster for Jack Kennedy. He bought this private plane called the Caroline. After
Sinatra doing commercials. I mean, you had
He had Sinatra doing commercials and a Kennedy song to the tune of High Hopes.
Right.
And in addition, Joe had real connections to the mob, and he used the mob to spread money around, first in the primaries and then in the general election, and also the mob, and then particularly this guy, Sam Giancana, who was the head of the Chicago mob, had the squeeze on some mob-run unions like the Teamsters. And so the heads of the Teamster locals all throughout the Midwest came in to get their marching orders from the outfit in Chicago, and they were told, get out to vote for Kennedy. So Joe Kennedy and the mob and illicit money all played a big role in the campaign.
Can we draw parallels between Joe Kennedy and Donald J. Trump?
Well, no, because Joe Kennedy was the man behind the scenes, and Donald Trump is very much
just his characters,
the man in front of the scene. Well, in character, yeah, I suppose. But the one thing I will say, and this is what I find so astonishing. Just to fast forward a little bit, Nixon loses the election, and there's a lot of pressure on him as they find out about this vote fraud in Illinois and Texas. A lot of pressure on him from Republicans to contest it, and ultimately, I think that there's some indication behind the scenes he may have pushed the protesting, but Nixon conceded the election the day after. He met with Kennedy a week later. When an investigative reporter for the New York Herald Tribune was investigating the fraud, he told him to stop. My whole point being that even if it was stolen, the idea of the peaceful transfer of power was so ingrained in America, was so just, beyond any challenge, that Nixon accepted it and decided he wasn't going to protest. He wasn't going to fight it. It was the height of the Cold War. You weren't going to put the country through the ordeal. And that is the most dramatic comparison to 2020 and 2021, because, of course, Donald Trump did all of those things in an election where there was absolutely no evidence of vote fraud.
What's so interesting about the Nixon brand, I mean, he was probably the most notorious president, has been up until recently. And you think about the work he did with China. You think about the story you just told. You think about what he ended up going down for, cutting out 12 minutes of tape. And some of the, what's the word I want to use? Crimes and misdoings, what happens today, and how the difference of level of intensity and what was at stake and what we live with today, and how he was seen as notorious and almost seems quaint by today's standards.
Yes and no. I mean, I would argue, somebody else came up with this line, and I must say I love it, is that I almost think that you get the origin story of a villain here, because Nixon, who had a bad reputation, he was a real slash and burner, and he used to attack people he was running against when he ran for the House in California and then the Senate. He would say that they were communists. He ran in 1950 against a woman who'd been an actress and a politician, Helen Gahagan Douglas, and called her the Pink Lady, and pink right down to her underwear, pink meaning communist. But in 1960, he was trying to run as a statesman. And I think what he took away from that entire experience, even though I think he did the right thing in not challenging the election, but I think what he took away from it was you do whatever you can to win, and there's nothing that's too dirty. And so I see what happened in 68 and particularly afterwards with Watergate as being, kind of, as I say, the origin story came from 60. I'm never going to let that happen to me again.
Interesting. What are some of the other parallels? Because somebody who's following today's election, why they should be interested in this book?
Well, as I say, one, it's a great story, but in terms of its resonance, I'll give you a perfect example. January 6th, under the Electoral Count Act of 1887, on January 6th, in the January after the November election, the Congress gets together to certify the electoral vote, and it's the vice president who is in charge of the certifying of the electoral vote and the election of the president. So in January 6th of 1961, Nixon is the vice president. He has to go certify the fact that Jack Kennedy beat him. So he goes there, and it turns out that this was the first time in 100 years since John Breckinridge during the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. This was the first time a vice president had to certify he lost the election to his opponent. So he's there in the House chamber. The votes come in. There even was a fight over Hawaii, and because it was within about 150 votes, and it really would have been a legitimate thing for Nixon to throw back to the Hawaii legislature. He says, no, Kennedy gets the votes there. He certifies the votes. He declares, this is the first time in 100 years that a vice president has had to preside over his own defeat and to declare his opponent the winner. And hereby I declare John Kennedy the President of the United States, and nothing could be a stronger statement about the strength of our democracy. And he gets Nixon gets a standing ovation in the House of Representatives for being such a good loser. Now contrast that to January 6th of 2021 with Trump, having the rally and the ellipse and saying, if we don't fight and fight like hell, we're not going to have a country anymore, and sends the crowd down to break into the Capitol. And Mike Pence, in Nixon's position as the vice president, although he wasn't running for president, but he's in that same position. He's going to preside over his defeat for vice president. And he says, despite hectoring by Trump, he says, under the Constitution, I cannot do anything other than count the electoral vote. I can't sit there and send it back to the states. That's when the crowd turns on Pence. They start yelling, hang Mike Pence, put up a gallows. And we now know from the filing from the special counsel, Jack Smith, Trump is sitting in his dining room next to the Oval Office. And when somebody comes in and says, hey, they're going after Pence, he goes, so what?
Yeah. Certainly kinder, gentler times in 1960. Hey, I want to talk a little bit about some of your most recent interviews. I got a kick out of a Dennis Quaid interview. He's playing Reagan, and you got into it with him in a movie that he was drawing the parallels of Reagan and Trump, and you quite astutely were saying, well, actually, no, it's quite the opposite. You went through a litany of reasons why. That was an interesting interchange.
Well, yeah. One, I said, in terms of foreign policy, Reagan was the original peace through strength, and nobody stood up to the then Soviets more than Reagan did. Obviously, a lot of people have stood up to the Russians more than Donald Trump has. Reagan was a free trader, absolutely believed in global free trade. Trump, a big tariff guy. And then there's just the question of behavior. It was Reagan who talked about the 11th commandment, thou shalt not speak ill of another Republican, and Donald Trump speaks ill of everybody.
Yeah.
And what I said to Dennis Quaid is, I know you're trying to draw parallels and say that Trump is today's Reagan. I said, I think, and I covered Reagan for 6 years in the White House, I said Reagan would have been appalled by Donald Trump.
Yeah. There were another interview I really liked was Stephen A. Smith, and you were kind of pushing him. He's one of my favorites. I had him. He's done the podcast. And you were pushing him on, he'll probably get a contract worth $25 million. You were kind of pushing him like, are you really worth it? And he was like, you're damn straight I'm worth it.
Well, no, what I said to him was, there's talk that he wants a 4 or 5 year contract for $100 million.
Well, yeah, $25 million a year. Yeah.
Right. But for multiple years. And I said, are you really worth that much? And he proceeds to tell a story about how his worth and how he knows his worth, and he's been number one in the mornings and for how many years? I mean, look, I agree with you. He's a very talented man.
Yeah.
And the end is you're worth what somebody is willing to pay you. But he then brings up Dak Prescott, the
highest paid quarterback
for the Dallas Cowboys, who just signed a contract for, I think, about $250 million.
Yeah.
And he brings him up and he says, look what he got. And I said, Stephen A., he's the quarterback of the Dallas Cowboys. He says, my record is a hell of a lot better than Dak Prescott's is. And you know what? He's right.
It was a great interview. Hey, before I let you go, give me some closing thoughts on what you think the next few weeks look like, what people should be keeping their eye on, the kind of Chris Wallace last month handicap, not to call a winner, but kind of what you see as either a possible surprise or the way things playing out in the next 4 weeks, because we're certainly down to the kind of grueling finish line here.
Well, one thing I wonder about is whether Trump is getting squirrely. And remember, if Trump loses, he doesn't just lose an election. He's probably going to go to jail.
Yeah.
He's got all these cases that if he's president, he can throw out. And if he's the losing Republican candidate and Kamala Harris is the president, he's got 2 cases in federal court and one in Atlanta, Georgia. He's in real trouble. In addition to which, he's of course already got the criminal conviction in New York City. So he's got a lot going on. And the reason I say I wonder if he's getting squirrely is what he's been doing just this last week about Hurricane Helene.
It's even off the charts for him.
It's one thing to, talk trash about your opponent. He does that, or talk trash. He loves to take shots at me. It's fine. I'm a big boy. I can handle it. But when you're putting out information that, there's no aid, and these poor people in Asheville, North Carolina, and he says, all you can get is $750. And in fact, FEMA really has been out there, and $750 is just, money to get a toothbrush and some clothes, because everything you've had, you've lost. But there's going to be a lot more around. Now you're playing with real people in their real lives. And that just, one, it strikes me as shameful. It also strikes me as stupid politically. And if this thing starts to get away, I don't think it will. I think it's going to remain very tight till Election Day. But if it starts to get away from Trump, I could see him really acting out in a destructive way. The other thing that is, and this is certainly no original thought on my part, and we're already talking about it at CNN, it's not election night.
It's election week or election month.
Well, certainly election week. I was already talking to the executive producer of our election coverage, and she said to me, "Well, look, here's your job for Tuesday night, but basically wall off the rest of the week because you've got a number of these states where in Pennsylvania, They count the mail-in vote after. They passed this ridiculous law in Georgia at Trump's behest, where they're going to hand count every one of the millions of votes, even though they got machines. I promise you, hand counting is, one, a lot slower, and two, a lot less accurate. So,
Yes.
I just think my deepest hope, Donny, whether it's Trump or Harris, is that it's a decisive election. I would really love it to be 55-45. Somebody has 350 electoral votes, and that there's no doubt.
By the way, even if it's that and Trump loses, he will still contest it. I would put anything. It doesn't have the same teeth, but there will be new stories of why it was. The explanation will be, how could this be? It was so close. The polls were close, and now all of a sudden they lose. So the story will be weaved. As I said, it doesn't start out with as much teeth, but by the time they're done with it, it'll be a fairy tale.
Yeah, you know what? I'm more of an optimist than you are, but you're more of a realist than I am.
All right. Chris, always love talking to you. The new book, which is just out, Countdown 1960, behind-the-scenes story of the 312 days that changed American politics forever. The parallels between today are incredible. It's a story.
And can I just say one thing, Donny? As long as we're really trying to sell this book, you learn about the love quadrangle between Jack Kennedy, Frank Sinatra, Sam Giancana, the head of the Chicago mob, and a woman named Judith Campbell, who was an Elizabeth Taylor lookalike.
Yes.
And she's kind of going around among the three of them.
Now you sold the book. Now you sold. I'm the marketing guy. I should have led with that.
Yeah, we should have led with that. But it's a hell of a story. And Kennedy is carrying on this open affair with Judith Campbell in the middle of the presidential race, even takes her back to his townhouse in Georgetown to sleep in the marital bed because Jackie is out of town for a few days.
The media world was a little different in that time. I don't think Jack Kennedy. I don't think Jack Kennedy would have been Jack Kennedy in today's world. Chris Wallace, thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you, Donny. My pleasure.
Everybody, thanks for watching. If you like it, hit that subscribe button. And we love having you here watching On Brand. And just don't miss any future episodes. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We'll see you next time.